Today we're talking about male victims of abuse and betrayal. Do good men get abused by their wives? Yes, it happens. But men are much more likely to stay silent than women are, and much less likely to be believed. And that's why I'm grateful to John for allowing me to interview him. I appreciate his willingness to speak about these matters and give us a view into his life. So let's jump into this interview with John, where I ask him how he met his wife and what attracted him to her.
I signed up on a dating website for Christians, and the woman who was to become my wife read my detailed profile and contacted me. She was photogenic, but there was more to it than that. I didn't have any doubt about whether she would be interested in me because she'd made the first contact. She was a bachelor's graduate from a respected Bible college, and she held a professional position in a healthcare setting. She offered spiritual and pastoral support, including counselling, to patients and their families at an incredibly challenging stage in their lives. I thought such a person would be easygoing, agreeable, and open to a range of outlooks on life. Both of us were in our 40s, and she told me she had met quite a few men, but had never been in a relationship for more than 6 weeks. She'd always been the one to end it, and she was still a virgin too. I thought, wow, no baggage. So here's a woman who's interested in me, and our profiles had both made it clear we were looking for a potential marriage partner. She knew I'd been divorced 12 years earlier. We spent almost every weekend together, seemed to get on very well, and we introduced one another to church friends and relatives. She seemed wonderful, everything went well, and we were married 9 months after our first meeting in person.
It all sounded so promising, didn't it, John? But I know that emotional abuse usually starts in pretty hard to identify ways. How did your wife start cutting you off from your friends and isolating you from supportive people? And what did you tell yourself that kept you in the relationship?
A few weeks into our marriage, we discussed having children. We'd only touched on that subject before, and I mentioned that the now adult foster daughter that I had from my previous marriage was the closest that I have to my own daughter. She seemed shocked, and I tried to explain how I'd known my daughter since she was 3, and that was over 20 years ago. I decided not to tell her that this young woman, who she had met several times, sometimes called me Dad. At our ages, there was no time to waste with trying to conceive. We had a lot of fun with that. Sexually, we'd decided to restrain ourselves somewhat prior to marriage. But once married, all that worked very successfully. We were completely compatible in that way. It was so reassuring because my first marriage had almost completely lacked significant sexual intimacy. I gradually discovered that my wife was against me maintaining past friendships. At first I thought it was only about women friends, and I was very clear that I would never insist on meeting a woman friend on my own. My wife would join us. When I received a wedding invitation from a long-standing male colleague, my wife asked me about the significance of the invitation. Why had we been invited? Why did I want us to go? This man had been a significant friend and colleague for over 15 years. My wife was opposed to either of us going, but she relented a few weeks before the wedding. I went along, but I felt distraught at going when I knew my wife had been opposed. I felt so bad about it, I felt so awkward there that I didn't even speak to the bride and groom. But they knew I'd been there because I'd left a present.
And that's just incredibly distressing, John. I mean, what woman wouldn't want her husband to attend the wedding of a longtime colleague and business contact? And yet, we've talked before, I know your story, and I know this is just the beginning of things she did to demean you. And one of those was the fact that you were a farmer. You had orchards, you had fruit, you were raising sheep, and it's shocking to me the stories you've told me.
She fed all the lamb to a colleague's dog. It was an insult, and I wondered what farmer, having grown a crop, would throw it all away. It made no sense at all. I felt so demeaned and devalued, and before we met, she'd read on my dating profile that I was a farmer. She knew exactly what I did. When I left school, I'd wanted to go into agriculture, forestry or engineering. By the time I met her, I was employed as a professional engineer, and at home I was a small-scale farmer who'd planted a new wood. I'd achieved all three ambitions. Having my wife devalue and disrespect what I did, when she knew about it well before we were married and from that profile, along with her insisting that I was not properly valued in my work either, felt so demeaning. She would assert that she was a better judge of people because she had a better upbringing and because of her professional role. She even had a nickname that implied she was of very high standing in society. I ignored that possible red flag, but some friends later told me they noticed it. She claimed I was not sufficiently respected at work and deserved a job with better compensation. I was happy in my work, I was a professional engineer, and I had no wish to change. She would demand I apologise for things for which there was no reason to apologise, like her waking up while I was driving in the car in an appropriate manner along a bendy road, lightly accelerating and using the brakes. If I didn't apologise, she would lecture me and tell me that she was brought up to apologise. She'd do her best to provoke me and get me to argue. Then she told me she was telling a counsellor colleague about my inappropriate behaviour. It was just so confusing. Do you know, she even criticised me for being English. It sounds silly, but it's the extent to which people go sometimes. She was of a different nationality and she had books about the idiosyncrasies of the English. She used them against me in an unpleasant manner. And an American friend noticed and asked me how I coped with that. That American friend was in fact a personal counsellor.
So even your personal friends were noticing her treatment of you. And that's really distressing. And it distressed them so much, they pulled you aside and said something about it. Now, how did your wife treat your foster daughter?
A long time before I met my wife, when my foster daughter was 19, we had a discussion about relationships. I told her that if she wanted, when she married, I'd be happy to walk her down the aisle. My wife asserted her professional experience, claiming she was a better judge of people than me. And she knew my foster daughter's family would hate me for walking her up the aisle. So, as instructed, I contacted her real father, who I already knew had no interest in attending the wedding at all. He confirmed that he wasn't wanting to attend the wedding, and he was quite happy for me to see his daughter up the aisle. My wife, though, was still opposed, and she told me a brother should do it. So I checked that out. But my foster daughter didn't want to do that. She said, "They're my brothers. I don't want them to walk me up the aisle." It dragged on for some time. Eventually, I think the groom must have intervened. I didn't know him very well at that stage. He and my foster daughter just had no knowledge of why I'd become so reluctant, and they weren't to get to know until my own marriage ended.
You know, John, it must have been horrible to disappoint your foster daughter and feel you could say nothing and make no explanation. Here we often say, happy wife, happy life. It's a message that says as long as the husband agrees to everything his wife wants, the family will be happy.
We had so many differences of opinion, and I wasn't allowed to pull away from disagreements. I had to accept what she said. When things got too difficult, which was regularly, eventually I'd back out, walking away. She stopped me going out, claiming she feared I might come to some harm because of my state of mind, that she insisted I was in a poor state of mind. She would stand blocking the front door to prevent me leaving. She was incredibly confrontational and told me any attempt to move her so I could escape was me being abusive to her. So my only option in these situations was to make a sudden sort of run for it when she wouldn't expect it. But then we went to couples counsellors, and she got these counsellors. They agreed that I would stay in the house, and I very reluctantly consented. I felt I had no choice. So to get any peace, I had to suddenly run up the stairs into a bedroom, often grabbing a laptop on the way so I could make notes in a journal. I'd put a chair against the door and she would taunt me to come out.
I mean, the idea, John, that your wife felt she was entitled to have things her way, that she would physically block you and could enlist professional counselors to side with her, must have made you feel incredibly trapped.
I was married to a woman in a highly respected professional position, which included the public expression of Christian ministry. She would tell me she could do whatever she liked to me, that I could do nothing about it, and she ridiculed me when I pointed out that her sustained attempts to deprive me of sleep were torture. I didn't always respond especially well, but when you're deliberately sleep deprived by your abuser, who'll not let you go to bed, deliberately wakes you up and picks on you most whenever you're ill and can't concentrate well enough to complete a sentence properly, it becomes extremely difficult. I just couldn't think straight. I was always reminded about those times when I'd not responded very well, and I don't ever recollect her accepting responsibility for her own behaviour. She was deliberately provoking me. I felt trapped, unable to seek help. Gradually, the abuser gains power and control over their victim, whose self-esteem becomes very low. I was aware that battered men are frequently laughed at and ridiculed, and often assumed to be the perpetrator.
Absolutely. We have such a double standard about abuse, and it's just assumed that only women are abuse victims. And we know that's not true. I want to highlight a few things in your story. You mentioned sleep deprivation, which is one of the worst kinds of abuse, and yet one we never talk about. People ask me, why do victims stay so long? And you said it perfectly. The abuser's power over the victim increases because the vulnerable spouse's self esteem declines to the point where they no longer feel they deserve any decent treatment. I'm always interested in finding out how the victimized spouse finally wakes up and sees reality. You had an old friend who was a domestic violence advocate, and she opened your eyes to the truth. Tell us about that.
She was the person my wife was most determined to keep me away from, and she checked my emails to ensure we were not in contact. One morning I felt an urgency to contact her. It would not go away. We arranged to meet that day. I believe it was God's guidance. I'd completely forgotten about my friend's domestic abuse advocacy, but she told me, "You're experiencing the classic cycle of domestic abuse," and she drew an elementary Duluth wheel. I didn't know it was called that at the time. It explained the patterns of behaviour between me and my wife, her isolating me so much that I had little support, minimising and demeaning me and asserting her professional credentials and upbringing, denying that her behaviour was in any way abusive and blaming me for any response of mine that was only me trying to cope with her abuse. It helped confirm that my wife was doing her very best to portray me as her abuser. I realised I was being exploited in many ways. She had told me she was telling a personal counsellor at work about my behaviour, and that she could do whatever she liked. I could do nothing about it. A few hours later, I read the official definitions of domestic abuse on the website of Mankind Initiative, and I read some other men's stories. As I began to properly recognise that so much of what she'd done to me was domestic abuse, I wept and wailed loudly. It was just such an incredible shock to actually read it, to see it there, and realise that it had happened to me.
As you're telling your story, I just get this deep, visceral response to what happened to you, that cry from the depths of your being. And all of us who've been through intense betrayal or abuse have that moment when we finally realize what was done to us.
I still find myself occasionally being cruelly challenged as a perpetrator. I don't recollect church-based accusers ever inviting me to tell them about the abuse or to offer any evidence. They simply attack me.
Now I want to change the topic completely to something a bit more happy. Many abuse victims have been told that they attract abusers, that it's a problem within themselves, and so they're afraid to ever date again. But you are now happily remarried, I want to know, tell us your secret. How did you approach the dating scene and determine how to navigate it?
When my wife started divorce proceedings, I realised it was best to move on. Before I met her, I'd been in a relationship that was not in the slightest way abusive. We'd decided to part because I felt I should marry a Christian woman. I think it was that prior positive experience that gave me the confidence to move on. I signed up on a dating site that was very selective. I could only see my matches, and the only women that could see me were ones that were matched up with me. I went on a few dates, and it helped me realise I had not been the problem, and most women are not abusive. It helped me build some confidence in myself. I spent a very long time finding out about the woman who became my new wife. It took me a very long time before I could talk with her in detail about my experiences. The woman who became my new wife is utterly different to my abuser. We support one another in so many ways. Life has its challenges, but she loves helping me in the woodland, and she grows most of the crops herself.
You know, I just want to stand up and cheer for you. I'm so excited for you and your wife. Now, let's pivot, and I want you to speak to men directly. What do you want them to know about male victims of abuse? Why do they stay? What does it mean? Does it mean they're less of a man? And where should they go for help?
Men, if you think you're in immediate physical danger, get out of there and contact the police. That's important. You need to look after that safety, your own safety. If not, search out an organisation that states specifically that it helps male domestic abuse or domestic violence victims. The best ones often have men's stories on their websites. So if you wonder whether what is happening to you is abuse, check them out. Many men do this very secretively, searching online when no one will know they're doing it. Often national organisations, like the Mankind Initiative in the UK, which is mankind.org.uk, can direct a man to other support nearer to his home. Men stay primarily because they fear losing contact with their children, or they fear their children will be abused, and not being with them, they can't provide protection. This is a sign of your strength. You're not weak in dealing with this and admitting that domestic abuse has happened to you. It happens to some very strong men. In fact, I can think of various men from the army veterans, and actually men sort of currently sort of in the army who've experienced domestic abuse. It was tough for them to speak up about it. Men often have a very strong commitment to their marriage, so many are not quitters who walk away from their responsibilities easily. Often they've been controlled so much that they feel they cannot seek help, and they often fear they will be seen as the abuser. The authorities are gradually getting a better understanding of male domestic abuse victims and how to help them. But an organisation that you speak to that specifically sort of helps male domestic abuse victims will be able to help give you some guidance on that.
John, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for educating us. I pray your story will give hope and insight and empathy to other men who've experienced this. And I just wish you the best as you advocate, as you speak out, and as you show other men that there is life after an abusive marriage.